Right.
Hi everyone, welcome back again to St. Catherine of Siena in Houston for the 20th Sunday in Ordinary Time. The first reading from Isaiah is from what's known as the third scroll, Isaiah 3 or Trito Isaiah. And the first Isaiah that wrote the first part of who wrote the first scroll is often called Isaiah of Jerusalem. And then you have Deutero Isaiah, the second Isaiah, and then you have the third. He is the one who writes as they are coming back or are back, or at least the first wave from the Babylonian exile. Their experience in Babylon obviously opened up their minds in all kinds of directions. But one thing it did, living among foreigners, invariably was that they realized that these people who were different to themselves maybe were not so different. Here you have a sense of universalism, where Isaiah says he has a vision for the future. God speaking of a time when humanity, the human family, would be one as God is one. Remember, humanity is made in the image of God. We're the ones who fracture, divide, and scatter. God is still calling humanity to be the one that God created it and destined it to be. They will come to God's holy mountain, Mount Zion, to God's house. House initially refers, of course, to the temple, but when Isaiah wrote this, the temple was destroyed. You know, when we speak about the house of David, we're not talking about a particular house, 3-4 story, and a roof and a turret, and don't ask me, and a drawbridge. We're talking about the household who comprised the house of David. So when Isaiah says, my house shall be a house of prayer, from the Christian perspective, Jesus resurrected is the new temple. The new house of God is humanity. Actually, one of the last chapters in the book of Revelation is that God's dwelling shall be among them. He shall dwell in the midst of humanity. That's what's envisaged here. Also, there is the idea that outsiders, foreigners, Gentiles, non-Jews, who we are, will be welcomed into a place where very often we were not welcome, and that was into the temple, into the household of God. Of course, the original household of God is the Jewish people. When Paul in the letter to the Romans is really wondering what's going to happen to some of his fellow Jews who have rejected the invitation of God to be part of this new expanded Israel envisaged in the prophet Isaiah and other prophets as well. And his comment here is that he feels that when his fellow Jews who have rejected Jesus as the Messiah see the success of the witness of these Gentiles in living the life of God, that they shall become jealous and reconsider it and be encouraged to join again. That is his argument. I'm not sure that it holds much for today, but there is a sense that those who have rejected God in whatever manner, the gospel, often reconsider the rejection in the light of the experience of witnesses to the goodness of God. It is our bad witness that turns people off and that we often reject. It is the good witness that is a light and attracts people. Reconsider. Think of how many of us and you know people who have come to church have had to rethink because of the encounter they have had. Hopefully a positive encounter. It opens up possibilities. And that's the basic line of Paul's argument in this small passage. The gospel, the Canaanite woman, the Canaanites were the original inhabitants of the hill countries of Judea, Cana. They would have been the original Jewish peoples. It would have been the kingdom in the south, comprising of the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. The northern kingdom were the other 10 tribes, also known as Israel. Notwithstanding, Jesus, in the face of opposition, this time with some of the Pharisees and some of the leading authorities, withdraws to gather his mind and not endanger himself unnecessarily. And he moves into the region of Tyre and Sidon, which of course is the land of the pagans, the Gentiles, predominantly. Very few Jews living there. By so doing, he highlights what Matthew will have at the very end of his gospel, and that is the church community in the name of Christ will travel in the same direction, out to non-Jews. And for the first 2 centuries, at least, 3 even, first 2, the problem of including non-Jews, outsiders, foreigners, the great unwashed, those who are not us, who don't come from our culture, all the usual, will actually be assimilated and included into the church community. We'll have a look at that gospel part, but just read them, have a feel for them, and we'll give you some more thoughts to ponder when you come back. See you shortly. Welcome back. There is an interesting, almost throwaway remark in the Gospel when the disciples, in response to this Canaanite, meaning a foreigner, a woman of a different religion, or maybe none, the fact that the description of her is she's making a lot of noise and causing major furore. She is not accompanied by a man. There's no spokesman, not person, spokesman for her, highlights everything is stacked against her. She is an unaccompanied woman in a male-dominated world. She's a woman. That's against her. She is advocating on behalf of her daughter. Where's the man in the household? Where's the patron, the cousin, to do this for her? So she is literally by herself in every which way. When the disciples, in response to her cry for need, she refers to Jesus as Lord, Son of David. She addresses him, acknowledging that he has the title of the Jewish Messiah, the Son of David. So she knows something about him. And she asks for mercy. By asking for mercy, the implication is you expected, or at least it can be given by the person who's been asked. For example, when you or someone throws themselves on the mercy of the court, the implication always is the court, the judge, whoever, has the capacity to be merciful. It's not warranted or earned. Forgiveness is. Mercy is not. It's completely and way beyond forgiveness. It includes a graciousness that is in forgiveness, but forgiveness, how many times shall I forgive? The gospel tells you shall always strive to. To be merciful is the capacity of what God does and goes beyond just mere forgiveness. So by asking for mercy, she indicates, you can do this for me. And the mercy here would be to heal her daughter, whose life is curtailed in some manner. It's first century language. It just simply means she was tormented by a demon. We don't know what was tormenting her. It's beside the point. Anyway, the girl's life is curtailed. It's minimized. She's not living her potential. Of course, the mother's potential is also curtailed by the lack of charity and, you could say, the bigotry and bias of the disciples. And at first sight, it seems that Jesus is not too far removed from it either. But before we get there, 2 Sundays ago, when after the death of John the Baptist, Jesus wants to get away and be by himself, He gets into a boat, crosses the lake. When he gets out, lo and behold, the great unwashed, the maddening crowd is there to meet him. And the disciples' response to Jesus was, when it came to evening, remember? Dismiss them. Get rid of them. Let them go look after themselves. The villages are nearby. He does not do that. He actually asks the disciples to feed them. And the gospel passage ends, well, actually the following Sunday, last Sunday, when he dismisses, interesting, not the crowd, the disciples to go across the lake and remember the storm. He and he alone dismisses the crowd. And only when they are fed, taught and looked after. Not just dismissed to be rid of, but when they were adequately cared for. Interestingly, in both instances, Jesus has taught his disciples, you shall not get rid of people just because you're not in the mood or feel like it. We have the same thing here, so don't lose the context. It's important. Again, the disciples, slow learners, say, dismiss her, get rid of her. Now, knowing that he did not do this twice before, you would expect, well, here we go again. Slow learners are these boys and girls known as his disciples. He doesn't dismiss her, but he ignores her. And one little thing I read during the week which I thought was helpful. His response to her is crass, cold, unchristian. When he speaks, he doesn't speak to her at first, he ignores her. She keeps after him. And she looks for help. And Jesus announces to her that he was sent by God to his own people, first and foremost. St. Paul is aware of that. God's first choice was Israel. A Sunday ago, or two, the passage read from Romans stated that the Jewish people's was the covenants, the law, the worship, the patriarchs. God does not rescind the covenants he made with Israel. That still stands. Another reality which comes out in the gospel, God's first choice was Israel. We Christians come in on their tailcoats. In fact, St. Paul in chapter 11 of Romans states that the Christians were grafted on the wild briar onto the olive tree. The olive tree, Israel, was never replaced. It was not cut down and it was not replaced. We were grafted on. The promises still remain. God's priority was Israel. We are included now in that priority. That's the difference. Consider for a second the thought that I found interesting. We're not told anything of the demeanour of Christ, other than the dialogue is not helpful. But supposing for a second, those of you who have a sense of humour and are quick-witted, this woman is quick-witted, very. I always think that Jesus had a fabulous sense of humour and was inordinately quick-witted. Supposing for argument's sake, when Jesus says, well, I was sent to look after my own family first. Now, supposing he was smiling as he said this, it changes everything. He wasn't scowling and grinding his teeth and kind of through his lips and behind her back. Think of it for a second. Watch her response. She comes back so fast and just reminds him something very common. You know that the bread that's fed to God's children, Israel, was not meant to be given to the household pets. Most of us grew up where the pets in the house did not get the child's food. Think of baby food, for example, especially made for the baby, the young child. You're not going to give that to the dog and then think, oh, what will I give the poor child today? That's what's going on here. Priority. If there's something left over and the child is not in the mood and you decide the child has had enough, the dog will get it. That's what's being said. But the woman comes back inordinately fast and quick-witted and states, yes, God's priority is Israel, was Israel, and has never been different. But we can be included in Israel's blessings, the blessings of the patriarchs. That was Isaiah's vision. We shall come to the mountain of God. We shall learn from our Jewish forebearers. And her quick-wittedness, I think of the two of them smiling, one outdoing the other, reminds him, this is not, the gifts of God in Christ are not only for your family. If you were to consider that everything you do and have and are is only for your family, you would be inordinately impoverished. The world would be too. The neighbourhood would be. The church would be. If we as a nation or a state or a city or a neighbourhood think what I have is for me, me, me and me only, we become narrow-minded, selfish, and we do not expand our capacity to be better people. I think this is what's going on here. She simply states that we can be part of this too. And that was a struggle, by the way, in the early church, reflected in Matthew's Gospel. Matthew's Gospel was written predominantly for Jews who were followers of Jesus and included some Gentiles. And there was always the issue, what do we do with these awful people? They're not part of us. Do we include them? Or do we do what the disciples in the prior 2 Sundays passages of Matthew's Gospel? Get rid of them. Let's hold on to what we have. It's all ours. If we start sharing it, we'll have less. But wasn't that the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000? The more that was shared, the more that everybody had. And the more we share, the richer we all become. We don't become impoverished. It's by holding on to what we have and ignoring the needs of others, we become the impoverished. There's another idea here as well. Just to give you 2 ideas. And that is, the woman, like many women today on the edges of society, not accepted as equals in all cultures, religions or otherwise, or among all our fellow human beings, even in the first so-called developed world. She stands for a minority. She also stands for people who are victims. We need to learn, and when I say we, I include me, we need to learn to be open to the cries of those who have been victimized. Look, for example, how inordinately difficult it was to listen to the voices of children who were victimized and brutalized. Because we believed this couldn't happen. It's beyond the capacity of a human being. It's not. The more we deny something, the greater the evil becomes. The victim needs to be listened to, not told, go away, and dismiss them. Children should only speak when spoken to. Now, what happens when those victims are adults? And they are minorities. They are peoples of other religions, ethnic backgrounds, not as educated and so on. The voice of the victim and their history needs to be listened to, or we perpetuate the evil and the sinfulness and that which could be described as the demons that possess us in our church, society and as individuals. There's a very harsh, difficult lesson, which we're always learning, by the way. Negating a reality and living in denial only leads to the diminishment of everybody. It extends the victimization, and the perpetrators are also much diminished. The gospel is calling us to newness of life. This is God's vision for the human family, inclusive of all. Consider these things. Now that we have the voices of some who have been drowned out and dismissed and poo-pooed as, we don't want to hear you. The gospel says maybe we should. And there's that lovely sense of the determination of the woman who stands for the victimized. She uses her wit. She is persistent. She's not told no, but she's told of priorities. Yes, but I can be part of the priority of you becoming a better person, a nation becoming a better people, so on and so on. These are all possibilities. The gospel is good news for everybody. But it also highlights that sinfulness, whatever those demons are that the poor girl was suffering from. You could say that the disciples were suffering from demons too, and what possessed them to want her dismissed and silenced. Lots to talk about. Open that one up, especially in this moment in our history here in the US of a have a great weekend. Take care.